Module 2 is in part based on my research. So I'm going to just spend a second going through about how I got involved in all this. I'm an archaeologist by background, and my area of interest has always been the symbolic and ritual use of place and of built environments. In that context, especially if you work here in Hawaii, but also in my Chinese research, is you become very, very aware of the fact that you, from different points of view, different perspectives, different cultural backgrounds, you can end up not only with different cultural landscapes, but you end up with different cultural landscapes that lead over the same physical landscape. In other words, three different people from three different cultures can look at the same thing and see it in three entirely different ways. None of them are right or wrong, but they are uniquely different. And so, especially in archaeology, since archaeology by definition is the study of material culture, archaeologists look at stuff. They look at the objects that are left behind by groups. They look at the way the groups shape the landscape. And when you have it available, you look at the way the groups have written about and talked about the landscape. So archaeology and geography are intimately related, probably as much as archaeology and traditional cultural anthropology are related. So in my background, back in around 2010, Second Life had become popular about 4 or 5 years earlier. But most importantly, by 2008, 2009, people were talking about moving universities and classrooms into Second Life, which was a big thing for a while. In fact, we did it at Chaminade. And so I became interested sort of in two aspects. One was the idea of what would it be like to port courses into a virtual world, and what did that mean? What were the advantages that you might have if you're trying to teach a class, especially in, say, anthropology or geography, because obviously cultural geography in a virtual world would have some real advantages in terms of the way you can visually talk about things, especially to an audience that's dispersed over a number of locations. So that was one of the main areas. When I got into Second Life and started looking around at it, as per usual with most folks, I really couldn't make any sense of it. So being an academic, the first thing you do is you start doing research, and acquired the sort of, the basic research texts that had been published by that time that were coming out about Second Life and how it worked. And it so happened that Second Life, by virtue of sort of some happy accidents, some anthropologists that were actually working in Palo Alto on sort of .com, stuff. One of them became actually tied into Linden Labs, who developed Second Life when they were first working on it, and wrote a fascinating work about the actual way in which people interact and how this virtual world was built from the standpoint of the actual coders, the folks that actually built it. There was also work by Bullersdorf that came out roughly at that time, which was actually looking at the actual idea that you have cultural landscapes and cultural groups in Second Life. And so I started to look at it a little bit differently at that point, rather than a sort of digital virtual world, which was an abstraction. I realized that what these other folks were saying is it's not actually an abstraction, it's actually just different, in the same way that going to Japan is different than living in, say, London. So the complex part became how different is different. And so in that context, when I started to look at Second Life, there's a whole set of criteria, which I'll get into later, that really make it sort of interesting when you consider the options that are available. Now, from a social scientist standpoint, especially that of a geographer, because if we think about perception reality, going back to the theory, one of the huge problems with perception is you have a really hard time, if you're talking to someone, figuring out what their perception actually is. Because if they're looking at an actual landscape, if they're standing looking at the beach at Waikiki, it's very hard to elicit from them what the perception of Waikiki is, because it's sort of a matter of you got to know how to ask the right questions to get the right answers, and you've got to interpret the answers. So one of the huge problems if you're dealing with an actual physical environment is, since we deal with it in a very selective symbolic way, it's hard to figure out what people are actually reacting to or what they're actually seeing emotionally. It suddenly dawned on me when I was looking at Second Life that since it's digital and basically anything can be in Second Life, you can live in a box, you can live in a brick, you can live in a tree, you can live in a castle. All these are very, very easy to do in Second Life. They're all just about equally inexpensive. And so when you actually walk around the environment in Second Life, you realize that what you're actually looking at is people in many ways have given a very clear sort of roadmap of their perception of maybe not the world they live in, but the world that they would like to live in. In other words, they've actually, in a very clear way, visually and symbolically expressed at least some aspect of their sort of fantasy or idealized, or in some cases subjectively negative world. And they've done this in a format which advantageously for geography, you basically can walk around and just video record it by doing screen capture. So you basically have this stuff. The downside, of course, you don't know who you're actually looking at, because in Second Life, anonymity is key. So you're not actually sure who built that house, who lives in that castle. But you do know to a certain extent when you walk around that landscape, the things that you see in the landscape, since everything is equally cheap and equally expensive, the choices that people are making are clearly defined by their choices. They're not necessarily cultural choices. They're not necessarily group-based choices. Those we'll see. The interesting thing is they're very group-based, but that's not a option shaped by the coding or the parameters of the software. That's shaped by the consumption of the users. So if we go back from that sort of rewind, one of the main aspects of Second Life that was a huge shock, and I'll just give you this sort of a quick story. When they started using Second Life, they started doing what we call beta testing, where you basically have the program and you bring in a bunch of folks to basically test it. And you want to make sure it works and doesn't crash before you give it out to the public. And so in Second Life, their original attitude was that people would be using this platform, this virtual world, to develop games. In hindsight, I'm not sure why they thought that, but no, what they did. So they were totally shocked when they invited some people in, showed them how to use the program. And the first thing that people did is they started building landscapes, they started building trees, and they started building houses. And they started living in the house. They started spending time in the houses. And this was totally antithetical to what the designers had intended the program to be. But they were smart enough to realize that, hey, since the users are actually building these things, and we'll get into that in a second, then if that's what they want to build, that's what they want to do, let's just charge them a fee to do that and get out of their way. One of the things that makes Second Life radically different than almost any other built environment, this is certainly true of the new Facebook ones or even Sims to a certain extent, is that everything in Second Life is built by the users. The company that owns Second Life and built the coding and runs the system and collects the fees basically gives you a pretty much, flat, hill, but basically an environment with nothing in it. So when you go into Second Life and you see homes and you see cars and you see pets and you see all the other stuff you see, all those things were actually built by the users. Now, this makes it radically different than almost all gaming platforms, Warcraft or EverQuest or something like that, where basically when you're dealing with all these other ones, you have a group of coders that are building this stuff. And then the players actually, sort of play in this stuff. So the world's been built by the company. And then players sort of, inhabit and run around in the built world. And Second Life, the built environment around you is entirely built by the users. And what happens is users build stuff and then put it up for sale, and people actually buy it and put it down. So in my case, for example, I own property in Second Life and I've got some houses on it. I didn't design those houses. I actually bought those houses in Second Life Marketplace, and then put them on my property. And so when you're looking at the stuff in Second Life, you're not looking at something that some corporate entity designed. You're looking at something that a bunch of individuals built, or I should say designed, and other people built and put on their property. This makes it sort of the antithesis of a classic American subdivision where the builder buys the land and puts the houses up and people move into them. So it's sort of a passive aspect of that. In Second Life, it's highly active. One of the key aspects of Second Life that is still really sort of surreal is the fact that for a lot of the people in Second Life, they actually spend a fair amount of their time. In other words, averages between 10 and maybe 20 hours a week in Second Life, I suppose for lack of a better term, living in Second Life, and frequently in houses. So residences and homes and concepts of homes are really central because that's some of the most popular things that people buy in Second Life. So if you're then looking at that and then you reverse back to the idea, well, how real is all this? Then you go back to this early part of this whole PowerPoint, which is basically a bunch of different quotes about the idea of a home. Home and house are two different things. In English, it must be incredibly complex if you're not a native English speaker, because a house and a home are synonyms. They mean the same thing. But a house, if you think about it, a house is something that is just an object. It's a residential storage device. If you're a realtor, you don't sell houses. If you're a realtor, you sell homes, because home is an emotive concept. It's a symbolic concept. You think of those Christmas cards we were looking at, they showed homes. They didn't show houses. So home is, if you look at these quotes here, they're all different ways of talking about the same thing, which is basically the emotional context of home. And this is pretty much the idea of shelter is a human universal. The idea of home is not necessarily universal, but the idea of some sort of resonance of, comfort is, if not universal, it's pretty close to it in different human groups. So if we go through and look at these different quotes, just read them through and sort of notice how they're very similar. And they're talking about something that's very hard to define because it varies in both the eye of the beholder, but also just in the idea of what people actually want in a home. What is a home to them? This is sort of hard, I think, for Americans to understand more than most groups, because Americans are one of the few groups in the world that are migratory homes. The average on the mainland now, even through COVID and everything else, is that Americans change homes about every 4 to 5 years. For most folks in the world, this is surreal. For most of Europe and Asia, people live in the same home forever. They might change once when they change their lifestyle dramatically, but other than that, they'll have the same place for their entire life. And in many cases, it's multi-generational. The home's been in the family for a while. So this idea of home and house is actually probably more complex in American society, where people live in a home. They have, to a certain extent, maybe have an emotional relationship to it. But in many cases, they barely unpack the boxes before they're moving into another home. If you're a realtor, though, remember, you sell homes. You don't sell houses. Houses are cheap. Homes are based on emotions. So if someone sees the home they really want, they're going to, for example, pay more for it because it emotionally calls to them. Likewise, if the home scares them, of course, they're not going to want it. So homes as symbols are really important. And what the other part of this then is, notice how in these definitions, it isn't really clear what a home consists of. There's no definition of the type of roof, amount of rooms, what it looks like in there. So if you look at this context of home, then that gets us into sort of a way of looking at this a little bit differently. And we use home as our context here. So I'm going to walk through some slides. So I'm going to be doing some pause spurts as I go and switch stuff out here. Okay, this is sort of a trick question, but on one hand, this is a quintessential American home. And I'll give you a hint. We're going to be revisiting this a little bit later because this is actually a prefab home. But nonetheless, even though it's a little bit overdone, this gives you an idea of what American perceptions of home are. Here's a much smaller version. This is a tiny home, but nonetheless, now it's a tiny home, not a tiny house. And for some folks, actually, this isn't that much smaller than places I've lived in here, old plantation homes. But nonetheless, this is considered a tiny house, but it's actually a tiny home. In other words, there's that emotional context, and it fits the definition of what people would call it. Some people would call a home. So that's how different it was than the first one. It's not a different type of construction. They're both residential, and they're both perceptually acceptable to particular folks. Here's a Second Life home. Now, this is a home. It has an interior, the doors open and close, the whole 9 yards. But this is in the digital world of Second Life. Now, again, remember, this was built by a user. One of the people that lives or operates in Second Life actually constructed this. It's a very complex thing. Usually involves Blender or Maya a little bit. So it's a construct. In some ways, it's similar to what you can do in some of the AutoCAD programs, in the sense that you can walk through it, interact with it, lighting is variable, etc. But someone actually built this, and then someone else purchased it, put it on a piece of property. And it's a good bet they spend part of their time in the real world in this digital home in Second Life. One of the interesting aspects of Second Life, because it's virtual, is that this fancier sort of mansion type place would theoretically cost exactly the same amount as that other house. So the quality of these and the size of the digital home you're living in is not really commensurate with increased cost. You might need a slightly larger piece of real estate, but probably not. So people can choose whether they want that first house, whether they want this house, and then we'll segue to two other potential homes, all that are residences in Second Life. Okay, so here we see a classic sort of Tolkien-esque fantasy house. This is equally as inexpensive as the other two, or as expensive. So this again is entirely someone's choice in which one of those houses they would have. And again, remember, in Second Life, the company that built the land platform, other than putting the sky in, basically didn't do anything. Everything you see here, the flowers, the rocks, the trees, the house, all this, even to a certain extent, the land shape, was put in by the user. In other words, the person that's in Second Life as a player / user, or residents as they call themselves, is the actual person that either bought this or else made it. But one way that they put this piece of land on there. What makes it really interesting from a geographer standpoint is this property might be right next to that Tuscan piece, might not be right next to the other one. So as you walk down the street, you see this total disconnect in terms of the types of places that people have, but each one has their own sort of self-perception of what they would like to have, or the place that they would like to live in a digital world. And this makes it tremendously valuable from a research standpoint. Okay, so here's the last. This small house looks like somebody might see in LA. So it's sort of a, I'm not sure what to call it, not even quite 1930s Art Deco. But here's just a view of what part of the interior looks like. This is a house you'd purchase. I don't remember how much it cost, but they're very inexpensive. I think probably about 25 cents in real money. And then you put it down in your property. In many cases, you have the ability to change the colors of the wall, the siding, the interior, maybe. But what you've actually got is you bought yourself an empty house, and then someone else designed the house, but you now own it. You put it where you want to. You buy furniture and put furniture in it. So, among other things, you can remodel it. So in many ways, it fits the definition that we saw earlier of the idea of a home, in that people spend time in it. One of the really fascinating aspects about Second Life that I've never really been able to make sense of, since on one hand I've studied it, but on the other hand I don't really understand some of the motivations, is you'll very, very frequently, almost invariably, find kitchens in Second Life, and you'll very frequently find bathrooms in Second Life. Now, if you think about it for a second, you don't need a bathroom in a virtual world, and you really don't need a kitchen, because it's not like you're going to be making anything you can eat. Second Life, now you can actually have food, you can have pets, you can have anything you want. It's a digital world. It's only bounded by your imagination and whatever you can invent that puts itself in a three-dimensional digital environment. But you don't need them. But you'll find the vast majority of homes for sale in Second Life have kitchens, and in most cases have bathrooms. And this is undoubtedly due to the fact that people that want to buy them have requested these features. And this leads to a real fascinating situation. If you think about it, if people want bathrooms and kitchens in a digital house that they're going to spend time in, that means in many ways it's supposed to replicate aspects of the world that they live in the real world, even though they're not necessary. You don't need to sleep in Second Life. You don't need to make yourself a meal in Second Life, and you sure as hell don't need to go to the bathroom in Second Life. So the fact that people want to have that level of reality or functionality is fascinating. It also takes us back to the idea of theory, because if we think about it, the functionalist and a functional approach would have a really hard time with Second Life, because it's popular. There's a lot of people who have been in it now for 10 years, and most of them live in houses. Some of them are pretty exotic looking, but they have residences. And yet those residences do not serve any of the functions that would be defined by functionality in the real world, because it's entirely a digital environment. So you'll see this when you do the Second Life assignments. You'll see this sort of people living in this virtual world. But it's important to remember, and I can't emphasize enough, that when you're looking at it, it wasn't built by a group of developers. The people in Second Life, the users of the program, are the ones that have built everything. And that makes it really, really useful from our standpoint, because they're a form of both self-expression, i.e. the builder, but they're also a form of self-expression in terms of the consumer, the person that bought this house, for example, and put it on a piece of property somewhere.